I think we can begin now. Is that fine, Mr. Gorjestani?
Yes, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Dr. Samuel M. Jordan Center's lecture series. Specifically, today we have actually a book discussion of a recent book that has been published by the title of Ahead of Their Time, The Legacies of Mohammad Mosaddegh in Iran. And Javid, can you give me the last name, Mr. Gorjestani?
Ziad Gamsakhurdia.
Gamsakhurdia in Georgia. And of course, today, Mr. Gorjestani is going to just talk about the first book. And the first book itself, which is on not Gamsakhurdia, but rather on Mohammad Mosaddegh, is indeed a massive tome of, I think, 12 chapters. And if you look at the amount of research done, it is at least 1/4 of the book, about 250 pages of this book are just documentation and citation of the 700 and some page tome. Having said that, let me just briefly introduce Mr. Gorjestani. Nicolas Gorjestani is a former senior official of the World Bank with economic development experience spanning more than 4 decades in countries undergoing transformational change. The result of decades-long study and research utilizing multiple primary sources. This book that we're going to be discussing, and the other one, which will probably be discussed in other venues, provide a unique perspective based not only on the author's professional experience, but also on his intimate knowledge, of course, of Iran. Born in Iran of Georgian heritage, Gorjestani has maintained cultural links with Iran and followed its political economy for more than half a century. Mr. Gorjestani currently lives in Washington, D.C., if I'm not mistaken. And right. I think how we would begin this is actually really to have Mr. Gorjestani himself discuss actually how this book came about, and then tell us about the book itself. And then at the end, we will open the session to questions and answers. Please, Mr. Gorjestani.
Thank you very much, Professor Daryei, and thank you for the introduction, your kind words, and also thank you to the Jordan Center for organizing this event and inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. As you said, this book is part of a 2-volume work, and today I will talk only about Mosaddegh. As most of the audience probably is aware, Mosaddegh insisted that the Shah had to reign and not rule. He also nationalized the oil industry to end the British colonial exploitation of Iran, and for that, and some other things, he was overthrown in a coup. He was tried for treason, sentenced to 3 years in prison, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest and enforced exile in his country home in Ahmedabad, where he died in March of 1967. I, of course, didn't know Mosaddegh. I was a 6-7-year-old lad in Tehran starting school. But I remember the debates at home about Mosaddegh, and also I vividly remember the 28th of Mordad, when we started hearing crackling noise. My older brother, took me up to the terrace to see where the noise was coming from. And we lived a few blocks away from Khiyaban Kakh at the time. And it was clearly coming from the direction of Mossaddegh's compound, a few blocks away from us. Throughout my life, I was fascinated with this exceptional political leader. I was attracted by his patriotism, ideals, vision, governance, and philosophy. The most important premise of the book is that Mosaddegh had the right ideas, but at perhaps the wrong time, because he was ahead of his time, and hence the title of the book. Early historiography about Mosaddegh was written by what I call the victors. and largely distorted his character and what he stood for. It was time to revisit previous hypotheses and arguments based on decades of my research into Iranian records, as well as the declassified official documents of the UK, US, and the World Bank. It is impossible to summarize 800 pages and 2,000 footnotes. Therefore, I will share with you only some of the highlights from my observations and conclusions regarding Mossadegh's values, governance, overthrow, as well as his alleged shortcomings, the legacy he left behind, and finally, perhaps a few lessons that could be drawn from his story. Mossadegh, as some of you may know, was born into a royal Qajar family. His mother was a royal princess. He entered public life from a very young age. He was a Mostofi, which is a financial administrator in an important province, Khorasan, at the age of 15. And he later rose to be a minister, several portfolios, several governorships, and he was also the first Iranian doctor of law with a degree from Switzerland. His mother had a great influence on Mossadegh's character. She told her son, quote, "The weight of individuals in society is determined by the hardships they endure on behalf of the people." According to Mossadegh, that advice became a program for my life, and after that, whatever insults I heard made me feel readier and equipped to serve my country. Mossadegh's value system was a synthesis of modernity and indigenous codes. He was a very Iranian child of the Enlightenment, with an emphasis on the very and Iranian. He understood modernity correctly to be a process of transformation of mindsets and values. He made a distinction between modernization and as a structural construct, and modernity as a mental concept. One could pursue structural modernization without necessarily transforming underlying value systems and social rules. This condition can be called pseudo-modernism. Many of Mossadegh's contemporaries often fell into the trap of authoritarian edicts to modernize without necessarily leading to modernity. Mossadegh strongly opposed Reza Shah's edicts to ban the hijab for women and to force men to wear the Pahlavi hat. He took issue with the authoritarian manner in which these edicts were imposed, not with the concept. With the same vigor, Mossadegh resisted Ayatollah Kashani's pressures on him to impose the veil and ban alcohol. Here is Mossadegh's illuminating reply to Kashani. "The government's purpose is not to lead people to heaven. The government's duty is the correct use of resources to improve the welfare of the people." Mossadegh had a very interesting attitude towards religion. In the spiritual realm, he was a man of faith, but in the political realm, he relied on reason. Mossadegh often said about his identity, "I am Iranian and Muslim." His understanding of Islam can be discerned from his doctoral dissertation, Last Will and Testament in Shiite Jurisprudence. He wrote, quote, "In Islamic law, religion and law are two inseparable disciplines. Both have human reason as a common source. This source is sufficient for the law to continue to develop and adapt itself with the new requirements." Here, Mossadegh is arguing that in governance, the most important lever is reason, not dogma, and that law must be changeable under new social conditions. His life's high purpose revolved around two ideals, national sovereignty and liberty. In his mind, these ideals were intertwined concepts like two sides of the same coin. Mossadegh's strategy to fight against tyranny and colonialism is summarized in one archetype and a three-pronged strategy. The archetype was peaceful struggle. Mossadegh was a strong admirer of Gandhi, and in fact, the only decorative item in his home was a small ivory statue of Gandhi. And his strategy was to expose malgovernance and corruption, oppose policies that are against national interest, and propose solutions to important societal problems. Excuse me. Mosaddegh always tried to reform the system from within. He was not a revolutionary. He never looked to overthrow the regime. Even when the Shah fled Iran following the failed coup attempt on August 16, 1953, Mosaddegh did not agree to abolish the monarchy. He had very interesting conceptions of power. I'll make three observations here. He did not seek power for power's sake. In fact, he refused offers to become prime minister on 4 occasions, and on 1 occasion actually resigned. He eschewed political parties and preferred to lead a national movement. This was a strength when he was in the opposition, but it generally became a weakness when he governed. In power, the National Front was challenged by weak organizational discipline, lack of ideological compass, and personality rivalries. Second point is that Mosaddegh didn't abuse power to suppress his people. Under Mossadegh, security forces occasionally committed violence against protesters. He immediately fired those responsible. By contrast, his predecessors and successors ordered security forces to suppress protesters. Finally, Mosaddegh showed great courage standing up to power. He stood up not only to Winston Churchill, but also to the two Pahlavis. Mosaddegh was one of the very few political elites who opposed Reza Khan's ascension to the throne because of concern for dictatorship. Two illuminating tales about the different mindsets and values between the two Pahlavis and Mosaddegh. The first is an encounter Mosaddegh had with Reza Shah. Arriving at an audience with the Shah, Mosaddegh says to him, quote, "When I was coming to see you, my eyes fell upon a huge archgate. Why does His Majesty desire such a majestic building?" Reza Shah answers, "It is my house. Don't I deserve a house?" Mosaddegh replies, "The Shah's real home is the heart of the nation. If he has that, he does not need buildings." Then he adds, "What is the purpose of erecting ceremonial arches in the provinces and bringing people in borrowed clothes to welcome the Shah?" Reza Shah replies, "Your questions have no answers." The second tale is about an encounter that Mosaddegh had with Reza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza, in 1941 when the father was exiled. And Mosaddegh gives the young king some blunt but prophetic advice. He says, "Do not pursue the policies of your father. Choose the people around you carefully and don't back the same people he backed. Disassociate yourself from the unacceptable past and make your own history. It does not matter if you are thrown out, as long as you are respected for having done right." Alas, if only the young man had listened to the old man. Meanwhile, let me now turn to Mossadegh's governance. His overarching goal was to tame the oppressive state, empower society, and change the mindsets. Let me say a few words about the context for his governance, because this is very important, and then his philosophy of governance before addressing some of his specific reforms. In terms of context, first, Iran was suffering from extreme poverty and dire economic conditions, including slow growth and in the non-oil sectors and systemic corruption that had depleted the public treasury despite the oil revenues. The National Front was an amalgam of political parties with different orientations. There were liberals, left-leaning, and religious conservatives all under one tent, which led to internal discord. Third, the British were accustomed to owning Iranian prime ministers and interfering in the country's internal affairs. And finally, Mossadegh's government did not receive any substantial foreign assistance during its time in office. Mossadegh's philosophy of governance is very interesting. I have 3 observations to capture what his philosophy was. His lodestars were sovereignty, democracy, social justice, and empowerment. And 3 quotes summarize this philosophy. There could be no freedom without national sovereignty. Iran can only be reformed and governed through democracy and social justice. If you want to reform the economy, the country, you have to involve the people, and the society must be brought into the reform process. Instead of saying, I will do the reform, and if you don't like it, I'll arrest you. Here, he was no doubt hinting at Reza Shah's approach to reform. Second, his philosophy of governance was people-oriented and not ideological. He did not follow any isms. For him, there was only one ism, and that was patriotism. The closest political school of thought to his philosophy was the European social liberalism and Thomas Marshall's social citizenship. In a nutshell, Mosaddegh envisaged an Iranian social democracy. His ideals and principles underpinned the many policy initiatives and innovations that he undertook. The principle of sovereignty was the driving force behind the nationalization of the oil industry, the doctrine of passive balance, and the economy without oil strategy. The rule of law principle underpinned his initiatives to force the Shah to reign, to protect freedom of the press and political parties, and to codify citizen rights and responsibilities. Justice would inspire his initiatives to provide social welfare protection to workers, to end peasant servitude, to protect the poor, and to promote equitable growth with shared prosperity. The principle of empowerment would enlighten his quest to promote citizen participation in the political process through free elections and through elected city and village councils. Now, about his reforms, Mosaddegh is generally associated with nationalization of the oil industry. While it was a very important act, his contribution was much more than that. I think he should be remembered for his bold domestic reforms as well. Mosaddegh was the originator of several novel ideas and policies, which I describe in chapter 6 of my book. Excuse me. To reform state structures and implement progressive policies more quickly, he obtained legislative powers from the Majlis, and in 27 months passed 203 laws, unprecedented pace of 1 per 4 days. To take the country towards an Iranian social democracy, Mosaddegh, among other things, freed the peasants from forced labor, bigari, and empowered farmers. He freed the press and empowered the urban citizens, established the national social security system for workers, which was unprecedented at the time. Even the United States at the time had only 15 years earlier established the social security system under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In addition, he established 30 city councils and 19 village councils. And during the 27 months of his premiership, Iran arguably enjoyed more democratic freedoms, better rule of law, and more equity, equality before the law than during any other era in modern history. Here are 3 examples. In his first act as prime minister, he put out a circular to his security officials saying, the press can write about me whatever they please. And in fact, they did, with the most virulent epithets all the way up to the day of the coup. In reply to the ulama and the fadayan, he declared, quote, our task is not to impose political and religious ways on the people. We only have the right to intervene when law and order is not respected. Some of the religious authorities are asking me to impose the wearing of the veil and to close the nightclubs. I will never do such a thing. Man is free and has the right to choose, and everyone is accountable before their God. Finally, when Ayatollah Burujerdi asked him to go after the Baha'is, Mosaddegh replied, quote, in my opinion, there is no difference between a Muslim and a Baha'i. They are all Iranian and part of one nation. On the downside, however, being a Democrat in a revolutionary context led to some chaotic situations and a perception of lack of public order. Long before the Arab street, the Iranian street was very active, passionate, and often violent, with a lot of disturbances and clashes between the Tudeh supporters and other political forces, especially Nicolas Gorjestani and Hezb Zahmat Keshan. To chart a new foreign policy, Mosaddegh developed the doctrine of muwazaneh manfi, the passive balance. He became a role model in the region and among the developing countries. According to Jawad Abdul Nasser, Mossadegh's policies against British colonialism inspired Nasser to nationalize the Suez Canal. And muwazaneh manfi was also the inspiration for the non-aligned movement, and Mossadegh is considered the grandfather of that movement. To reestablish Iran's sovereignty, as I mentioned earlier, he nationalized the oil industry, but with a commitment to compensate the former company, AIOC. And I discuss that in detail in chapter 7 of the book. The problem was that the AIOC and the British government never recognized the Nationalization Act and insisted to continue to control operations and profits. The British government responded with draconian sanctions and threat of invasion, which then eventually was blocked by President Truman. Mossadegh was willing to negotiate on the modalities of the compensation, but not the principle of Iranian control of oil. For him, this was a moral issue. Winston Churchill, on the other hand, was willing to give Iran a few more shillings per barrel, but not give up the control of oil. For him, it was a control issue. These positions were irreconcilable, except in a Faustian bargain, in other words, the return of AIOC in disguise. Mossadegh refused to go for such a bargain. In the meanwhile, the US had played a very clever game in Iran. Their goals were threefold: dislodge the UK from monopoly of Iran's oil, prevent Iran from operating the industry on its own, and enter the operation and marketing of Iranian oil. The US strategy was to support Iran initially, to weaken the UK, then support UK once the UK agreed to let US oil companies in on the Iran's oil pie. In 1950, a US diplomat told the Iranians, quote, "Throw AIOC out, negotiate new terms, we'll take up the slack. American ships will pull into the dock tomorrow and buy your oil. Don't you guys worry." This was their strategy of getting the British out and getting themselves in. The other issue with the Americans was whether their policy was driven by the Red Menace. If you recall, at that time, it was the height of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union had 1,500 kilometers of border with Iran. So the Red Menace and oil, well, I think that the US generally looked at Iran through the prism of the Red Menace, but its perspective passed through a thick, very thick oil filter. The Dulles brothers, one of them became foreign secretary, and the other one head of the CIA. They were both steeped in the oil business, both lawyers, with Samuel and Cromwell, who was the law firm working for the AIOC. And there were others in the US government that were very much in the oil business. The US, finally, the US preferred to deal with an autocratic client like the Shah rather than a popular democratic government led by Mossadegh. In the event, to get the US on their side, the British offered a big carrot. In November of '51 meeting in Paris, Anthony Eden promised Acheson that the American companies would be allowed a share of the Iran's oil industry. British sanctions and threat of invasion did not bend Mossadegh. Therefore, he had to be overthrown and a more obedient government installed that would accept British and now also US terms. That was achieved with the consortium agreement after the coup, when US companies made good on Eden-Acheson deal and took over 40% of the Iranian oil pie. There were a total of 6 proposals to resolve the oil crisis. Most of them relied on clever wording to camouflage the true intent, which was maintain the de facto control, foreign control of operations, and or impose such burden of compensation that Iran would be mortgaged for decades. One proposal by the US was actually accepted by Mosaddegh, but rejected by Eden. One proposal was made by the World Bank. At the time, even Mossadegh supporters criticized him for not accepting the World Bank offer, but unfortunately, they were not privy to what went on inside the World Bank. And now I have a story there that is based on some of the information that I've gathered from the recently declassified archives of the World Bank. There were 2 missions in early 1952. The second one was led by Robert Garner, who was the vice president of the World Bank. In a nutshell, the bank's proposal involved reactivating Iran's oil operations for export, with the bank acting as a managing agency on behalf of both parties to the dispute and not the Iranian government alone. And 2, hiring of UK technicians to operate the facilities efficiently. These 2 provisions would emerge as insurmountable obstacles to an agreement with Mosaddegh. As I said, there are these archives that have recently been declassified. I've had access to them, and I first started looking at them in 1980, 40 years ago. And over time, I've gone through some 2,000 pages of these documents. Most of them show what was going on behind the scenes and not what the World Bank was officially putting out as its positions. My conclusions are the following: that the bank did not behave as a truly neutral international body, but as a de facto mouthpiece of the British company and government. In fact, before the bank made its proposal, 2 senior directors of AIOC spent weeks in the bank's offices in secret, talking about what the bank would be telling Mosaddegh. And at the time, before the missions went, there was no contact between the World Bank and any Iranian officials, like in the embassy or the executive director representing Iran on the bank's executive board. Second, the World Bank proposal was designed not as a development scheme. The World Bank is a development institution, not a commercial bank, but as a politically driven plan to function only with the UK technicians over 2 years. So the question was, why fixated on the 2 years, and why not 5 years, and the use of non-UK technicians, Americans, Germans, the French? By insisting that British technicians were indispensable for, quote, efficient operation, unquote, World Bank created a Trojan horse, so to speak, under its umbrella. The World Bank staff during this whole saga generally behaved in a professional manner and often tried to find reasonable options to bridge the gap on key issues. But the World Bank management, senior management, stuck to the initial design and rejected staff attempts to find compromises that Mosaddegh could accept. Quote, "Where does this leave the bank?" unquote, asked the lead staff in an informal note that he filed for posterity. His answer, quote, "From Iranians' point of view, selling them down the river if the deal is made, to the British, a convenient servant." Now, this is a very, very summary of pages and pages of documents that I have in the book, but we just don't have time for me to go into the details. There are some fascinating quotes there from internal memoranda of the bank. Those of you who will read the book, you should find it interesting. Now, to manage the external shocks caused by the British sanctions that could have plunged the economy into severe depression and hyperinflation, Mosaddegh introduced the strategy of economy without oil. And some of these things that I will be talking about actually have some relevance today, because the Iran has been under very strict sanctions. Now, the Mosaddegh faced a fourfold challenge, in a sense. One was to adjust the economy to external shocks. Second was to mitigate the impact on the poor, stabilize the economy, and lay the foundations of a sustained path to growth by diversifying the economy that had been very oil dependent. His goals included promotion of non-oil exports and import substitution with domestic products, limiting non-essential imports, fiscal consolidation, control of inflation, and protection of the vulnerable. The policy tools included a flexible exchange rate that led to a 50% depreciation of the currency. The key short-term outcomes of these policies and reforms were quite impressive. Imports declined 20%. This is during the period that Mosaddegh was in power, especially the luxury goods. Volume of non-oil exports doubled. Balance of payments was sustainable at about 22% of GDP. Budget deficits were contained at a manageable level, again around 2% of the GDP. And the basic goods were available, especially to the lower strata of the population. And hyperinflation was prevented, but per capita incomes stagnated. And I have all the tables and the data in the book. Even CIA analysis put out just before the coup concluded, quote, "The Mossadegh's financial problems are unlikely to produce an early crisis, despite his his probable continued resort to the printing press to meet current expenses. Crops are good, the general level of economic activity is fairly normal, and such inflation that has developed shows no signs of soon getting out of control." In a nutshell, Mosaddegh implemented a de facto structural adjustment program 3 decades before the Washington Consensus between the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank at the time, but without any technical or financial assistance of the World Bank and the IMF. I think that is another example of being ahead of his time. Finally, Mosaddegh was unable to realize his vision due to a number of factors. 3 main observations. First, but the political context for governance was very, very difficult. Internally, the Shah had refused to reign and insisted on ruling. That itself led to a constitutional crisis. Mossadegh and the National Front formations that supported him were squeezed from the right by the reactionary elites that resisted transformational change, and from the left by the Tudeh party's advocacy of revolutionary approaches. In that context, political consensus to push for bold societal reforms remained elusive. Externally, the British wanted to continue to control oil and the prime ministers. The US sought a piece of the oil pie from the UK and to block the Soviet Union's control of Iran, and the Soviet Union considered Mosaddegh an American stooge and supported it today. Second, Mosaddegh was the target of foreign schemes from the first month in office. MI6 and CIA operations were buying Majlis deputies, politicians, and the press, and creating chaos to destabilize Mossadegh's government. In fact, in some of the British archives, you have information about the prices of some of these politicians and deputies. One of them was about 100,000 pounds. 2 weeks after Mossaddegh became prime minister, CIA officials, Alan Dulles, and State Department officials discussed getting rid of Mosaddegh for an quote-unquote autocratic alternative. The KGB was also very active through the Tudeh party to weaken Mosaddegh by violent clashes with the Mosaddegh supporters and penetration of the Iranian army. The Shah and his courtiers and the purged army officers like General Fazlullah Zayedi collaborated with foreign intelligence operations to undermine Mossadegh's government. And third, and this is the key, his vision clashed with the prevailing world order. While Churchill and Eden's mindsets were mired in 19th century colonialism and imperial bully politics, Mossadegh talked of national sovereignty and self-determination as a moral right. I think there are little echoes here of what is going on in the world today. Excerpts from Mossadegh's famous speech that is written on a blackboard in white chalk above his grave reads, "If we are not to be free to act in our own house, but instead have foreigners dominate us, put a yoke around their neck and pull us in every direction they want to, death is preferable to such a life." The world powers' implicit doctrine at the time was, either you are with us or we will make you be with us. Very similar to Bush's, you're either with us or against us. Mossadegh's passive balance doctrine was the equivalent of neither with you nor against you. Two personal observations about the West, especially the US. A sovereign liberal democratic government in Iran was not in the strategic interest of the big powers at the time. Western democratic idealism be damned when authoritarianism is the expedient best friend. And the failure of the West to support Mossadegh was in line with the following logic. It is better to have a reliable dictator who is with us than a democrat who is neither with us nor against us. Let me turn to the story of Mossadegh's overthrow. In a nutshell, he was overthrown not by a popular uprising, but by a conspiracy involving foreign and local elements. His opponents pursued a three-pronged strategy. First, destabilization. On behalf of the US, the CIA had a program called TP Be Damned, TP meaning Tudeh Party Be Damned. And through that program, they had a local network in Iran. The same with the UK, with the MI6 spies and their local network, the Rashidian brothers and their network. And after Mossadegh kicked out the British out of Iran, the MI6 equipped the Rashidians with radio links to the MI6 handlers in Cyprus and embedded two super spies in the heart of the court. One was an Indian Parsi, Shapur reporter, and the other one was Ernest Perron, a Swiss national whom the British had already planted to befriend Mohammad Reza when he was in Switzerland in school, and later on came to Iran. In addition, as mentioned, MI6 and CIA had on its payroll large numbers of parliamentarians, politicians, and news editors. The second prong of the strategy was disinformation, primarily through articles written by US and UK spies, Donald Wilbur, Richard Cottam, and Lambton, and published in the local press that were in the pay of the CIA and MI6. The third prong was the removal, which unfolded over several months, like a play in several acts over 2 years. The final act unfolded in two phases. The first was the attempted dismissal of Mossadegh by the Shah's Farman on the 25th of Mordad, which failed with the arrest of Colonel Nassiri. And finally, the violent overthrow on 28th of Mordad, when mercenary ruffian mobs and tanks commandeered by purged military officers eventually attacked Mossadegh's house and looted it. I have to excuse myself. I have a little cold, so I'm taking some tea. Now, it's a word about foreign involvement. In recent years, there's been considerable evidence that has emerged that corroborates the involvement of foreign intelligence agents and their Iranian allies, thus challenging the revisionist myths that it was an indigenous uprising, Qiyam Milli. My research has reached a firm conclusion about the role of the CIA and MI6 in the coup. Think of a culinary analogy. The chefs and the recipes were foreign, the raw materials were indigenous, and the firewood was locally procured using the funds that the chefs dispensed. Without the chefs and their money, the locals would have had a difficult time to cook the brew. Similarly, without the local ingredients and firewood, the chefs would have had a difficult time doing the cooking. The overthrow of Mossadegh's government was the first regime change by the United States and Britain since World War II. And here it greatly saddens me to talk about this, but it is very personal in terms of what is happening today in Ukraine. Most of you are probably aware that Russia has invaded, and that sort of made me think about Mossadegh and all those things. I was born in Iran of Georgian Ukrainian parents, and I lived through the coup against Mossadegh, and later on I witnessed the coup against Zviad Gamsahurdia, the first democratically elected president of Georgia that Mr. Daryai mentioned, which is the subject of my the second volume of my publication. And then today, I'm witnessing again this travesty and the attempts by a big power to suppress a small power. And I think it sort of raises some questions about similarities and differences. And there are some similarities. As I said, the one sort of similar trend is disinformation, destabilization, and overthrow, whether by coup or invasion. And one can at least see a slight silver lining in this history of 70 years, because 70 years ago, the West was the culprit. 30 years ago in Georgia, the West just kept silent and let it happen. Today, at least the West is standing up and saying something about it. So I hope that very soon the Ukrainian people will be able to reestablish their sovereignty. Let me say a few words about criticisms of Mossadegh. In chapter 9, I spend a lot of time looking at the pathology of the national movement and some of the allegations against Mossadegh. Now, my research assesses and in many cases challenges the critiques. And let me give you a couple of examples. The internal critics allege that Mossadegh was a dictator because he organized an illegal referendum and dissolved the Majlis. There's some context needed here. Mossadegh, at the time, suspected that there were about 40 deputies that were bought by the MI6 and were scheming to depose him through machinations in the Majlis. In fact, the declassified record shows that there were in fact 50 of them and not 40. And as I said, there were even prices of these deputies listed in some of these documents. Now, in a political crisis, typically in democracies, they dissolve parliament and call for new elections. The Mosaddegh, as a Democrat, went to the Shah and asked him to dissolve the Majlis and call for new elections. This is what happens in any constitutional democracy. The government goes to the head of state and says, I want to dissolve the parliament, so we have new elections. The Shah refused. Mosaddegh then turned to the people as the sovereign to resolve the matter. Now, it's true that the constitution, the Iranian constitution at the time, was mute on the question of referendum, but it considered people sovereign. In fact, the monarchy itself was an endowment entrusted by the people to the monarch, Article 35 of the Constitution, and the powers of state emanate from the people, Article 26. So Mosaddegh turns to the people. So the referendum, the question was it illegal? Just because the Constitution doesn't say that there is a referendum, the referendum by its spirit is a democratic act, because it goes back to the people and asking the people for their views. Moreover, if Mossadegh's referendum was illegal, then what about the Shah's referendum several years later under the same constitution? Now, after the referendum, Mossaddegh again asked the Shah to dissolve the Majlis, because according to the constitution, only the Shah could dissolve the Majlis. The Shah again refused. It was only then that Mossaddegh, on the 25th of Mordad, issued the following statement. In line with people's will, dissolution of Majlis is proclaimed. Now, it's important. He's citing the people's will, and he's not saying, I am dissolving, because he knows he cannot dissolve. He doesn't have the power. So the dissolution of the Majlis is proclaimed. Since only the Shah could dissolve it, the Majlis, in fact, remained in office. And they were meeting up to the day of the coup. So this notion that he dissolved it is incorrect. He called a referendum, he asked the people, and he obtained a result. But the Shah wouldn't go along. Another popular allegation is that Mossaddegh disobeyed Shah's farman to dismiss him. Now, some have called Mossadegh's action itself, disobeying, a coup d'etat. Now, the origin of this this notion is the work of the actual person who led the coup d'etat, Kermit Roosevelt, in his book, which is titled Counter Coup. Now, many scholars and specialists believe that the farmans were actually illegitimate because of the following convincing considerations. First, the farmans themselves were unconstitutional. Now, Article 44 of the Constitution says that the Shah has no executive responsibility. In fact, it says that he is exempt, mubarras, of all responsibility. And one of the issues in interpreting these things is that in sort of Western lingo, we make a distinction between the government and the head of state. In the Iranian constitution, it's sort of mixed together. So there are some functions of the head of state, like, for example, being the head of the armed forces, the supreme leader of the armed forces, having the right to declare war. But the government, as the executive, is very different. And the Shah had no executive responsibility. And in fact, the Constitution says in Article 44 that the ministers were fully accountable to the Majlis. And in Article 64, that ministers could not invoke Shah's written or oral order as an excuse to absolve them from responsibility before the Majlis. And Farman is actually a written order. And finally, Article 46 says that the Shah had only a ceremonial rule to issue, or in other words, to sign توشیح of the Farman, but only after the Majlis had given its view on the matter. Just like in any constitutional monarchy, like in Britain, the Queen signs the order, but it's only after the Parliament has decided who the Prime Minister is going to be. The Queen does not dismiss a Prime Minister in England unless the Parliament decides to do that. In fact, there is a very interesting tale that I recount in the book about Reza Khan himself. When Reza Khan was Prime Minister of Iran under Ahmad Shah, he was dismissed, exactly like Mosaddegh was dismissed by Mohammad Reza. So Ahmad Shah dismisses Reza Khan. He gets mad and he retreats to his village, Rudehen. The Majlis meets and rules that this was an unconstitutional act, reinstates Reza Khan as the Prime Minister, and sends a committee of the Majlis deputies to escort back Reza Khan to Tehran to reclaim his constitutional position as Prime Minister. Now, irony of ironies, guess who was a member of that committee? Mohammad Mosaddegh. So, despite the referendum, the Majlis formally was in office. It had not been dissolved till after the coup. Therefore, Mosaddegh had the authority from Majlis to legislate, and until the end of that authority, no one had the right to dismiss him, even the Shah, unless the Majlis had taken back the powers from Mosaddegh and decided to give him a vote of no confidence. And by that logic, one could argue that it was the Shah who violated the constitution. And it was a similar case to how Ahmad Shah dismissed Reza Khan. Third, it was a legitimate process. If it was a legitimate process, why did the Shah not have the Farman delivered in daylight through the Minister of Court per the established protocol, but instead by a colonel with tanks and at midnight? And finally, the Farmans appeared to have been tampered with. In fact, when Mosaddegh read the Farman and looked at it, he tried to call the Shah in Kalardash to check with him whether he had actually signed this, because there were these anomalies in the way the Farman was written. During his interrogation, Nasiri, after he was arrested, admitted that the Shah had signed the blank letterheads, and the text was added later by Hirat at the court. There were other irregularities. For example, Mordad was misspelled as Moradad. There was a different, the space between the Shah's signature and the last line was squeezed, that the text was squeezed within certain tight limits. And there was an issue with the date, the 23rd of Mordad. It was originally 22nd of Mordad. And then somebody added a little dandan, the tooth of the 3 in Farsi. So all of these things together raised some doubts as to the legitimacy of that Farman. And finally, the original dismissal Farman, as well as all copies of the document, have mysteriously disappeared ever since. Most curiously, the dismissal Farman was never introduced as evidence during Mossadegh's trial, where he had been formally charged with not obeying the Shah's order dismissing him. So they charged him for disobeying the order to dismiss him, but never produced the order as evidence in the court. My personal criticism of Mossaddegh was not in what he did, but rather in what he did not do. For example, Mosaddegh did not court-martial Zahedi and Nasiri. In any other country, people who were conspiring to overthrow the government, you arrest them and then you let them go. And he did not call on the people to take to the streets and defend the national government on the 28th of Mordad. And I think that Mossadegh's biggest missed opportunity was that he did not declare a republic after the Shah had fled the country. Can you say a few words about his legacy? I argue in the book that Mossadegh was the most patriotic, ethical, and honest Iranian leader of the past 2 centuries. He was born in the 19th century, he governed in the 20th century, but with ideas that are current in the 21st century. Finally, Mossadegh was the connective tissue that links the dreams of Iran's constitutional revolutionaries in the early 20th century with the aspirations of Iranians for freedom and rule of law in the early 21st century. There is no expiry date on the ideals that he espoused and gave his life for: sovereignty, liberty, rule of law, and social justice. To conclude with some of the lessons, I have 5 points. In a revolutionary process, it is nearly impossible for a democratic leader to succeed by governing within the rule of law. Faced with economic sanctions, governments should design policies that can reduce the level of hardship for the vast majority of the people and restructure the economy to make it more resilient. This is a lesson that is applicable today. To successfully defend their country's sovereignty against stronger powers, weaker nations need asymmetric strategies to counter and resist the superior military, political, and economic forces that have been arrayed against them. Again, very relevant today, especially in Ukraine. Imposing economic sanctions against a country does not always ensure that the government will submit to the will of the imposer of sanctions, or that the affected population will rise against the government. Finally, supporting dictatorships that are with you or helping bring to power puppet governments that are mere executors of your political interests is likely to be a losing strategy in the long run. I would like to conclude my talk today with Mossadegh's final remarks at his trial. He said, "My one and only sin, and my greatest sin, is that I nationalized Iran's oil industry and dismantled from this country the colossal apparatus of colonialism and political and economic influence of the world's largest empire, and that I locked horns with the most dreadful colonialist and foreign intelligence organizations." Thank you, and I hope that some of these ideas will prompt you to explore in more detail the vast amount of documentation that I have in the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nicolas, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Abbas.
Oh, good. To what extent was Kim Roosevelt responsible for overthrowing Mossadegh? Because there are varying narratives on this issue, that the 2 divisions of Iranian armed forces came from Gilan and from Isfahan or Rasht, I don't know, Gilan or Isfahan. And Kermanshah, exactly. So they came up. So who is really responsible? Another narrative is that Kim Roosevelt never even got to Tehran. He was just sitting on a tank crossing the border from Iraq into Iran and never did anything.
Well, interesting questions. I've had similar questions a lot. Well, 2 things. Those units from Isfahan and Kermanshah It's true that they had been contacted and they were on their way. One of them was on their way to Tehran in case it was needed. But by the time, before they even got there, the government was overthrown. So they technically did not have anything to do with the actual overthrow, but they did, they were part of the plan. In fact, Ardeshir Zayedi was one of them that went to, and Teymur Bakhtiar was at the time the head of the unit from Kermanshah, I believe, and had them come on the way. As to Kermit Roosevelt, I think all the evidence in the record, official documentations, now at least we have the latest edition of the Foreign Relations of the United States that was issued in 2017, actually for the first time has not a complete, but a hefty package of CIA documents. So you see documentation in terms of, day by day, hour by hour exchanges, notes, cables to Kermit Roosevelt, reporting from this safe house, from that safe house, how they had Zahedi hidden in a particular safe house, whose house it was, where it was. I mean, this is all, in real time as it was happening, they were reporting. So now we have that. Then we have, well, forget about his book, because there's a lot of exaggerations in the book, as you can expect. And the British, in fact, say that, he is trying to hog the limelight, that the British, Norman Derbyshire and company, were actually the ones who had a role in it. But at least what you can see in the record now is his back to office, not report, but verbal report to his superiors, including Allen Dulles, and exactly what happened, how it happened, etc. So that one is a record. It is in the documents. So I think this idea that Kermit Roosevelt never even made it to Tehran is really a myth.
So what about this shootout around Mossadegh's residence? If the divisions from Kermanshah and Isfahan were not participating,
they were not the divisions. I think that this is the unsaid. Actually, the unsaid hero was Achavi. He was a colonel, and he was the brain behind the military side of the coup, because there's the civilians, the Charukeshan, all the ruffians, etc., and the Tayyib, I don't know, Akbar Meskar, and the gangs. But then there was the military side of the coup, and that one was organized by Achavi. Now, Zahedi was a sort of the titular head, but he actually did not play a role in designing the coup, if you want. I mean, he was locked up in a CIA safe house till 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the 28th of Mordad, and when Kim shows up, he says, "Okay, you got to come out and you got to, go on the tank," and he was still having lunch, and he couldn't. He was so nervous that he couldn't put his uniform on, and one of the CIA guys actually buttoned him up. But the military strategy was very, very smart. De facto, they commandeered some of these officers that had been purged by Mosaddegh. That group of officers that was conspiring, they managed to commandeer about 24 tanks, Sherman tanks, that Mosaddegh had put in the Saltanatabad Padegan precisely. And the thing is that Mosaddegh accelerated his own downfall because he had ordered these tanks to be battle ready. In other words, they had fuel, they had everything oiled, ready to roll. And these guys, and you know, when you read the story, it's fantastic because it was really pure luck. Had one of these guys not been able to fool the guard on duty that night to come into the Pentagon and take over the tanks, it would have fallen apart. So the tanks had nothing to do with Bakhtiar's unit that was coming from Kermanshah. These were all from Saltanatabad, Pentagon. These were Sherman tanks that Mosaddegh had parked there precisely for that reason, that in case there is a coup against him, he could roll them out. What he didn't know was that there was that they would be able to fool the guards on duty. And another twist here, very interesting, Abbas, is luck again. The Riyahi, who was the head of the military at the time, he had called everyone for a speech that he was going to give. And it was that in preparation for that, all of these guys had gone to hear the speech, all the officers. So the Padagans were left under the guards, the guard duty. There were no officers, actually, the commanders in place in any of the Padagans. They were all called in. So the conspirators managed to, and there's a very interesting book by Mohammadi that sort of hour by hour, sort of minute by minute of how this thing was put together. And it was really the genius of Ahavi, of how he managed. But it could have fallen apart just like that with one mistake.
Fascinating, fascinating. And how did Mosaddegh find out about the 50 deputies that wanted to undermine him and get rid of him?
I don't know. Well, first of all, he knew how the system was, how the system worked. In fact, one of his, when he came to power, one of his, he had a two-part platform. One was nationalization, the other one was new elections, because to change of the election law, because he knew that none of the elections after the first Majlis were really run properly. They were not neither fair nor free. And people were just appointed, not appointed, but designated, and they would just get the ballots. And the ballots were, because most of the people at the time were illiterate, so the people in the local conscriptions followed the landlords or the local farmandars, you know, preferences, etc. And this is the way elections were handled at that time in Iran. That was his sort of assumption of knowing that the British were constantly, you know, interfering, etc. Exactly how he knew there was, he had suspected, I would imagine, and of course, a lot of people thought that, you know, this was a lot of conspiracy theory. But in the documents, when you look at first the British that came out a longer time ago, you could tell who were the ones who were bought and how many of them. And then the FRUS, the latest edition, has some very detailed documentation on, in fact, how to deal with those 45 or 50 and how to use them in order to topple Mosaddegh. So there is a little, in the CIA documents, there is a very detailed sort of step-by-step how to act, how to even create a forum, because one of the issues was when Mosaddegh wanted to find out about this, the National Front deputies, they resigned en masse, and to deny the quorum to the Majlis. CIA document says this is how you go about going around that. Number one, these guys actually, now this is the CIA telling them that the Iranian deputies have resigned, but their resignation is not valid because according to the rules of the Majlis, the resignation has to be read in the Majlis before it is becoming valid. These guys, they just, wrote a letter or declared that they are resigning. So technically, all those guys were still a member of the Majlis. Therefore, the CIA says, therefore, count them, meet together, declare that these people are uzr muwajjah, that is, they are excused with good reason, and according to the Majlis rules, they get in, they're removed from the quorum sort of denominator, and therefore, with whoever you have, you can call a quorum and you can do that.
I see. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank my long-term colleague and friend, Professor Daryoi. And I'm so sorry that I had technical difficulties for the first 10 minutes and I was not able to join the beginning and to introduce you, but I'm so happy that Courage did it. Secondly, thank you again, Nicolas, for a wonderful, informative talk. And hopefully when you do this at UCLA in a few months, I will be able to get on prior to your appearance on the screen. Anyway, thank you. I appreciate that. If there are any other questions, I just sit.
Let me see. There are a few. Yeah, it's about the Constitution and whether the Shah had. Yes, you see, the Constitution should be looked at as a package. First of all, recall that the Constitution was modeled on the Belgian Constitution, which was a constitutional monarchy. The whole spirit of a constitutional monarchy, a constitution of a constitutional monarchy, is democratic in the sense that the parliament is a key actor. Otherwise, if the king still can dismiss prime ministers and appoint ministers, then what is the purpose? What difference does that make from the old system? So the whole spirit of it was to create limits. And as I said earlier, there was this issue in the Constitution not distinguishing between the head of the state and the head of government. In Farsi, it's all hukumat, or, Therefore, that was the other problem. Third issue is that the Constitution has some paradoxes in it, as I hinted at. The Shah is the commander-in-chief. At the same time, the Constitution says that he is excused from all responsibilities, and only the ministers have the responsibility in front of the Majlis. So when you look at the Constitution, you can cherry pick one or two articles, but if you look at it all together, the spirit and think of the spirit of the Constitution, what it was trying to do, which was limit the Shah's powers. I mean, there are places there, and it was the amendment, which is, I think, Article 50, that was put in by the Shah in 1948, specifically said that he was the only one that could dissolve the Majlis, which is true. There was an issue. Now, in parliamentary democracies, the head of state does that, but it's the government that decides. Today it's Boris Johnson that decides to dissolve the parliament. It's not the queen. The queen just signs it. So this power of toshi, of actually signing it. There is a constitutional provision there that, the ministers are appointed by the farman of the Shah. The farman, yes, but he just signs it. But the farman, in the spirit of the constitution, has no validity unless the parliament has okayed it. So that's the way to look at the constitution. But I know that there is ambiguity. There is some ambiguity. Let me tell you another story of this ambiguity. Right from the beginning, I think it was Majlis Dovum, around Majlis Awwal Dovum, there was an issue of interpretation, precisely because of that. So the Majlis met, and then they went to the regent, because Ahmad Shah was at the time minor, so there was a regent, Nusrat-ul-Dawla, or Nasir-ul-Dawla, Nasir-ul-Mulk. And Nasir-ul-Mulk, as regent, says, I have no authority, executive authority. The authority is with the Majlis. So that was the first interpretation case. Another issue, another example, if you, as I mentioned, was the Reza Khan story, when Ahmad Shah dismisses Reza Khan as prime minister, and the Majlis says that's unconstitutional, reinstates him. So there was only in the question remained unresolved as to what happens during the periods of fetrat, that is, when the Majlis is not in function. It's the end of the Majlis before the next elections. What happens if the Shah decides to dismiss the prime minister? And there was only one case in the total history of Iran that, and it was under Ahmad Shah, Samson al-Sultaneh, and he was the only one. And what happened was he stayed in office, he insisted, and the Majlis supported him till Ahmad Shah sent the military to get him out. But most of the other ones in Fetrat, they had resigned themselves. There were cases that during Fetrat, the Shah can dismiss, but most of them they had already resigned. He just signed the farman, per the constitution. So that's the way to interpret the constitution. And the question of whether Mosaddegh was elected prime minister, that's a little bit of a sort of splitting hairs. In democracies, parliamentary democracies, it's the parliament that elects. People do not elect prime ministers; they elect deputies. Then the deputies elect prime minister. Decide who is going to be. Mosaddegh was the first deputy of Tehran. He had received more votes than anybody else, and it was the parliament that, elected him, selected him in a democratic fashion. Because up to that point, all prime ministers used to be appointed in the following way. The Shah would decide who he wanted, mostly under pressure from the Brits. And then the Majlis would go through the formalities of saying, okay, we're giving our vote of confidence to so-and-so. And then the Shah would sign the farman. In fact, when Mosaddegh became prime minister, while he was in the Majlis, and this was going on, Sayyid Ziyad, the guy who was picked to be by the Brits to be the prime minister, was actually with the Shah at court, waiting for the Majlis to go through that pro forma thing, for Shah to appoint to sign the farman. And it was this Jamal Amami's gimmick at the time. He knew that Mosaddegh had refused the prime ministership 4 times before. So he says, well, Mr. Mosaddegh, you're making all this talk and all that stuff. Why don't you come and become prime minister and take the matters into your hand? Why do you always criticize everybody? And he was convinced that Mossadegh would not accept. Lo and behold, Mossadegh accepted. And the ruse, and he had found out about the ruse because somebody had told him that, you know, they had already picked this fellow, and he is already in the court waiting for the pro forma majlis thing. So you have to put all these things, you know, into context. Well, yes, as I said, you know, some people say that no matter what his motives, his power grab appears unconstitutional. This was not a power grab. You know, when you go to the people and you ask the people, that's not a power grab. And he did not dissolve the Majlis because he knew that he did not have the authority. He asked the Shah. Now, what was the Shah afraid of?
Well, what was it that caused the Shah fly from Kelar Dasht with Soraya to Iraq if Mossadegh was not really a threat to him? So why did he fly so rapidly in a one-engine plane to Baghdad?
Well, because you see, when you look at, when you read the reporting of the people involved, particularly those involved in the coup on the American side and the British, the Shah was, you know, he was not, at that time, he was not a very strong personality. He was afraid. He was not sure of himself. And he did not have the personality of his father, and he did not have the experience of his father. And he procrastinated. In fact, there's, you know, pages and pages of frustration on the part of the American ambassador, the British ambassador, and the people at the CIA, that they can't get him to go along. He waited several months. I mean, it took the spooks several attempts to convince him. They even had to go and give a wad of cash to Ashraf in Europe, have her fly over to Tehran clandestinely, or under an assumed name. It was Shafiq, but in order to go and see her brother, to convince him to do that. They sent Schwarzkopf with suitcases full of loaded with money and all that stuff to try to convince the Shah that he should do that. So all of these things went on. And then when Kermit Roosevelt came, his meetings with him, but of course here we have only Kermit's version of the history, so we have to be a little bit careful not to take 100% everything he says. But the flow of things was that he was not very certain of himself, and he was afraid that if this thing failed, when Nasiri was arrested, the Shah knew that the plot would be exposed. And if the plot is exposed, his role in it would be exposed, and therefore he would be completely embarrassed, etc. He didn't know that they had this alternative plan that they put into motion. So I think that it's a little bit, you know, his personality. But had it been the Shah of 20 years later, probably he would not have done that. Yes. Let me see. Was Iran society truly ready for someone like Mossadegh? And he was very progressive, as he was a very progressive individual. Yes, I mean, the title of my book is Ahead of His Time. I mean, he was ahead of his time in relations with the West, even much more about in the context of Iran. I am not sure that had Mossadegh survived, you know, Iran would have been a democracy. I mean, maybe, but the country was not yet ready. I mean, 3/4 of the population were illiterate. Institutions were not developed. There was practically no civil society. Political parties were really clans. They were not really parties, except for the Tudeh party. So the culture, a pluralistic culture, did not exist. And in fact, one of the similarities between book 1 and book 2 in Georgia is the same. That, you know, it takes a certain culture, put aside elections and rules and constitutions. If the people are unable to think in a pluralistic way, you know, you are not going to get democracy in that sense. It's tolerance. It's tolerance of a different political position. Iran did not have it at that time. You were either part of this party or you were the enemy. So there was that thing in Iran. So I doubt that it would have been an easy. But the ideas, the ideals that he tried were novel. I mean, people did not know what to do with it. I mean, look at this Shoraye Deh and everything. I mean, for the first time, people were given, you know, they became protagonists of their own destiny in the sense of having a vote to select somebody who was going to be their representative in the Shoraye Shahr or something like that. So this concept of citizenship, the Shahrvandi, and the responsibilities that go with it, he was trying to build it. And because his view of democracy was not top down, it was not the Pahlavi's desire to modernize the society by copying the Western things. Mossadegh's idea was democracy from the bottom up, that you cannot develop a democracy in a society like Iran unless you empower people at the bottom, and they are part of it. Now, that would have taken a long time to develop. And I think that for those reasons, it would probably have been a very difficult time. Do Iranians around the world today truly appreciate the concept of the real democratic society? I don't know. I hope so. I hope so.
I doubt it.
Are Iranians ready for another Dr. Mosaddegh today? Well, you know, when you put it past all the trappings, I alluded to it. I said, you know, he was in my view, he was the connective tissue between the Iran of the constitutional revolution, the beginning of the 20th century, and Iran of today. And because the ideals, the aspirations are the same. I mean, nothing has changed. I mean, that's why I say Mossadegh's ideals have no expiry date on them. When you talk about sovereignty, hakimiyat milli, how can that thing expire? Azadi, you know, freedom. These are eternal types of ideals that people have. And as I said, he was not a member of a party, or, you know, he was not a party person. He was very much a man of principles. Very few principles in his mind. As I said, hakimiyat milli, edalat, what was the other one? Sovereignty, rule of law. He was big on that. So these things are eternal. Today, if you ask any Iranian about sovereignty, justice, rule of law, and empowerment, everybody will agree with it. The same way that they agreed 70 years ago. So.
Yeah, but I mean, a mullah's concept of law is very different than a Democrat or a communist or any other faction.
Yeah, sure. Because that's why I don't know whether you were there, Abbas, when I pointed to his views of religion and his dissertation. in his dissertation, he attacks this thing and basically says, law should be changeable. Governance is based on reason, not on dogma. I think that it was the principle in his head, that he was, as I said, he always said, I'm Iranian and Muslim, but his understanding of the role of religion in governance was very different than it is today.
That's very good. Well, I have to leave. So once again, thanks to Turaj, thanks to you, Nicolas, and thanks to Saeed, who was doing everything. I really apologize for the technical difficulty.
Oh, Turaj is back.
Yes, I'm here.
Turajan Tazari,
Thank you very much.
nice to see you. Nice to see you.
Very nice to see you. I was following the question and answers. Yes.
It's wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for arranging this talk. And I really enjoyed Nicolas' talk. Phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. The books are magnificent. I'm reading Ziviat's role, and that's even more interesting for me because I know nothing about it. So I'm learning a great deal.
Yeah, you can imagine in the last 24 hours, my mind is just blowing left and right. So I was talking to my brother today, and I said, can you imagine our three identities? They're all three of them
are coming together. Yes.
On the chopping block.
Yes, I know.
I really want to thank you, Nicolas, Mr. Gorjestani. Apostran, thank you for the intercessor here. Thanks for being here, and I wish you luck. I know you will be at Stanford giving a talk next at Stanford on this book.
March 3rd.
March 3rd. So people, if want to get more, please do listen into that Zoom talk at the University of Stanford at the Center for Iranian Studies. Once again, thank you very much, and I wish you well. Thank you, everybody, for actually kind of tuning in and listening to the fascinating book.
And Turajan, thanks, Saeed, for helping me with the technical difficulties.
Thank you, Saeed. Yes,
Nicolas, I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope it was useful to you.
I hope you have me back again for the next one, for the next book.
Yes.
If you want, we can. If you want, I can talk about the second book too.
Excellent,
yes,
excellent.
It will be a pleasure.
I love to hear that. Yeah. Thanks,
everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.